Well, if we haven't met, I'm Adam Jackley. I'm the senior pastor here at New Community. We're in the middle of a series called Finding God in the Questions, where we're looking at certain questions that point us towards faith. So I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine you lived back around the time of Jesus, and he invites you to get into a boat and sail across the Sea of Galilee together. It'd be amazing, right? Of course you'd say yes. So you pile in the boat and you start sailing, and Jesus had been doing his public ministry, so he's tired, so he actually spends this time taking a nap. Again, maybe not exactly what you'd want to do on a boat ride. Maybe you thought you were going to do like 20 questions or, what's the secret to life? But he is tired, he needs to take a nap. And then it becomes the worst possible time for Jesus to be taking a nap because a storm rolls in. It's a violent storm. The Sea of Galilee is prone to these like winds and waves and storms that can roll in just like that. And the boat is tipping and the waves are cascading over it, and the disciples are panicking. And then they realized, we have Jesus on board. He's just sleeping. So they go wake him up. He says, oh my gosh, you guys, let me handle this. He calms the winds and the waves, and then he spins on his feet and looks right at those disciples and says, where is your faith? Now, that's not just any question to get as a disciple. Faith is kind of at the center of the Christian faith. I can't even talk about what we're doing here without using that word, faith. Faith is it. It's not like Jesus was saying, hey, like, where are your chariot keys? I think they had those back in that. Where's that extra tunic I was going to give away? It's not even like asking, where's your courage? Where's your perseverance? To ask where's your faith, that is getting hit where it hurts. See, faith is central. Do you know faith occurs more times in the New Testament than words like kingdom, or grace, or church, or save, or righteousness? And it gets even more pronounced if you add in all the instances of the word trust. Faith is it. It's unique to the Christian faith. There's no parallels. In all the Greek religions, there was nothing like our concept of faith. The Jewish tradition that Christianity emerged from honored faith. It commanded it. It said that you believe what God said and you do what he said to do. You might heard of the guy Abraham, one of the fathers of the faith. He was sort of prototypical in what it meant to be someone of faith. God pulls Abraham aside one day and he says, look up at all the stars in the heaven. That is going to be the number of your descendants. And if you were Abraham, you'd be scratching your head because you're saying, I'm old, I don't have any kids, my wife is past her childbearing years. How is this going to happen? But you had faith it would happen. And one day you get this miraculous son, Isaac. And God says, I want to test your faith again. And so they hike up to the top of Mount Moriah with all intent to sacrifice that only son. And God finds a way to provide a sacrifice instead. But he honors Abraham's faith. He says, your faith was so vital and so important, I will credit it to you as righteousness. And in fact, you won't just be blessed. The whole world will be blessed because of your faith. Jesus had the perfect faith. And he asked, commanded that people have faith in him. So if you were a disciple on that boat that morning, you're not just getting some question. When Jesus says, where is your faith? He is asking something serious. This morning, we are going to look at a few passages that talk about that. Because you have to imagine, if you were the disciples and Jesus says, where is your faith? You have to ask yourself, what would you say? You'd say, well, Jesus, I guess my faith is in you, but also like you were snoozing while we were drowning, right? We were in peril and you were asleep underneath the boat. So I guess my faith is kind of in you, but it's also in the wind and the waves and what I could see. It's in Archimedes' principle, right? Like if we get enough water on this thing, it's going to sink. That's where my faith is. Where's my faith? My faith is in you, but you were asleep. But when Jesus gets on the scene, things change. He calls them to great faith. Maybe the boat almost sinking was part of what Jesus wanted them to experience. This morning, we're going to look at how we have that kind of faith. Now, if you follow along, if you get our email, leading up to this sermon, we had said we're going to look at Luke 8, and that tells that story. But this morning, I actually am going to tell a parallel. Matthew 8. It gives out some of the details that I want to make sure we focus on. We're going to look at a few stories in the Gospel of Matthew this morning. We're going to look at some challenges people faced and how their faith showed up, how God called the best faith out of them. And kind of our bottom line, the hook of the idea I want you to focus on this morning with me is this, is that faith is believing and trusting that Jesus is up to the challenges you face. Faith is believing and trusting that Jesus is up to the challenges you face. So we're going to meet a few people in these stories we'll read this morning. And first, there's just this staccato pair of stories where Jesus encounters some would-be disciples. We're going to start in Matthew 8 in verse 18 and 19. It reads like this. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, Jesus had just been doing a lot of miraculous stuff, and he needed some space. You ever been there? Like you've been doing some ministry, some public stuff, and then you just, I need to take a beat and get away from everybody. So he says, let's go across to the other side of the lake. He was performing miracles, and he just needed a minute. But before they are able to get on that boat, in this scene, a teacher of the law comes up to him, and he says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." It seems like exactly what you'd want to hear if you were Jesus, right? I'll follow you wherever you go. But we need to hack into this statement just a little bit. See, this enthusiastic young teacher of the law may have a sense of self-importance. See, it seems like he's talking more about his willingness to follow than Jesus' worthiness to follow. And he calls Jesus teacher again. At first blush, it doesn't seem like that's a big deal. But did you know that in the entire Gospel of Matthew, only non-disciples, non-followers of Jesus, refer to him as teacher? And so Matthew, as he tells this story, is using this as an example as someone who is on the fence, as someone who is thinking about committing himself fully to following Jesus. And again, it sounds like what you'd want to hear if you were Jesus. So how do you respond? Jesus says this. It says, Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Jesus sees this brash, brazen young teacher of the law. This guy who says, one translation actually writes, as if the man is saying, "Jesus, this is your lucky day because I'm going to follow you." And Jesus says back this cryptic thing about foxes having dens and birds having nests, but the Son of Man, a reference to himself, has no place to lay his head. Jesus, to this enthusiastic would-be disciple, says, "Slow your roll, bro. I want you to count the cost." Jesus doesn't want disciples at any cost. He wants would-be disciples to count the cost of following him. And so as you got to slow down, you need to take a beat and consider what you are offering to do. This is going to put you at risk. This is going to be the adventure of a lifetime, yes, but it's going to be tough. You need to slow down and think about it. So in this first scene, this enthusiastic teacher of the law, this guy says, "Jesus, it's your lucky day. I'm going to follow you." Jesus says, "Slow down. Take a minute to consider." Well, before they can get on the boat, a second guy comes up. It says this. It says, "Another disciple said to him, 'Lord, first let me go and bury my father.'" Now this one says another disciple. Here, it makes it seem like this person is already a follower of Jesus. Immediately, we learn that though becoming a Christian is a one-time deal, when you put your trust and faith in Jesus, you are good. You are destined to be with Jesus forever in eternity. Discipleship is different. Discipleship is something that seems like we can recommit to and renegotiate time and time again. When Jesus says something like, "If you want to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me." Jesus has in mind that discipleship is constantly renegotiated, constantly recommitted to. And here this another disciple is trying to respond to this new call to get in this boat and go across the Sea of Galilee. And he says, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." Now again, you read this and you go, this seems perfectly reasonable. In fact, one commentator said, you can hardly imagine a more legitimate, a more reasonable request than to bury one's father. How will Jesus respond to this? See, the giveaway word here is he says, first. There's not that many incidental words in Scripture. He says, first I need to take care of some stuff, and then I'm willing to obey you. You can almost hear the words of St. Augustine, one of the early church fathers. He was praying a prayer that he really wanted to give himself fully to Jesus. He wanted to fully follow God. And he prayed this. He said, give me chastity, Lord. Give me temperance. But not yet. Augustine wanted to have a little fun before he fully committed. He knew that God was calling him to follow him fully. And he said, yeah, I'm in on all that stuff. I want the chastity, I want the temperance, but let me just have a little fun first. Although this seems like a more legitimate request by this young man, he says, yeah, I'm sure I'll follow you, but first I need to take care of some stuff. How does Jesus respond? It says, but Jesus told him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Now here's the deal. Commentators do their best to try to lessen the intensity of this. They're like, maybe his dad wasn't dead yet and he needs to go back and fulfill his family obligations. I don't want to sugarcoat it. This is just intense. Jesus is saying, no, follow me now. Now it begs the question, did Jesus not want you to honor your mother and father? No, Jesus did that perfectly. But it was the fifth command, to honor your mother and father. You know what the first command is? Have no other gods before me. When Jesus said, you know what the greatest command is he recounted the whole law in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, do you know what he said? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. This is a tough command. This is God throwing the ball way downfield. I want you to follow me first. But instead, this man demands. You can almost imagine Jesus being willing if he just said, hey, listen, I do have these responsibilities. I want to follow you, but I'd like to talk about how I can honor my mother and father. Jesus, maybe second, after I follow you, can I make sure that I fulfill my family obligations? Jesus isn't unreasonable, but he's clear that even a perfectly reasonable request to put him second won't fly. What I love about Jesus, and this is the way I parent my own children, is he treats them exactly differently. You ever had the advice, you ought to treat your kids all the same? That is garbage. Jesus has time to treat people the way they need treated. To the enthusiastic young teacher, he says, slow your roll. To this reluctant person who wants to honor his mother and father, he says, you have to speed up. Jesus knows how to treat people, taking into consideration their circumstances. Jesus knows exactly what you need to help your faith flourish. And it won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. It will be hand-tailored to you in your life and what you need to step up fully into following him. Well, the story goes on. The scene develops. Verse 23, it reads like this. It says, then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came upon the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. Sound familiar? This is that parallel to Luke 8 that I opened the sermon with. And the disciples get on the boat, and they followed him. That word follow is always used of people wanting to be disciples. That's what he wanted from that young man. He said, no, follow me now and let the dead bury their own. These disciples, people that are interested in giving their whole lives to Jesus, follow him. And so they all pile in to the boat. And so they're on their way to cross the lake after these two encounters that Jesus has with the enthusiastic young teacher and the reluctant young man with family obligations. And as soon as they get in, the storm rushes in. So, a lot can happen on the Sea of Galilee. This storm rolled in, the winds whipped up, the clouds rolled in, thunder, lightning, waves. It can happen in an instant. That's what happened to these disciples, is that they go on this boat trip with Jesus and the storm rolls in. And they get freaked out. But again, Jesus is sleeping on board. So what do? It says the disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. This is incredible. They realize, hey, but yes, storm, but we have Jesus. And they utter just this incredible prayer. It's this series of individual words that if you looked at it, you could see them in Greek. They say, Lord, save dying. That's all they utter out. Now, they address Jesus right. In this situation, they know full well they don't need a teacher. They need the Lord of heaven and earth. They need someone who can step in and help. They're going to die, and when you are facing your mortality, you know you need something way bigger than yourself, way bigger than just a teacher. You need the Lord. And so they say, Lord, save dying. Have you ever prayed that kind of prayer? Where all you can get out is this kind of staccato series of words, God, help now. Lord, save dying. And Jesus hears that prayer and he honors it, but he wants to draw out faith because he says this. He says, he replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? And he got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Jesus, in the midst of this completely understandable, terrifying situation, has the audacity to get up and say, you of little faith. It's actually one word. He calls them little faiths. He says, your faith is paltry. Your faith pipsqueaks. I expect and demand more of you. He knew that Paul would write, for God gave us not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love and self-control. Jesus wants them to know that if they are with him, they're safe. Because faith is believing and trusting that God is up to any challenge you face. And so he gets up and he says, why are you so afraid, oh you little faiths? And he gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves, which, by the way, like, what do you say to rebuke them? Like, cut it out, wind, what the heck, right? And they die down and it was completely calm. Yes, he calls them little faiths, but he doesn't say they have no faith. People that have no faith do not experience this kind of stuff with Jesus, but even people with little faith do. There's a huge difference between no faith and a little faith. God can do a lot with a little, amen? And here he sees this little germ of a faith in these men, and he does something miraculous. Because faith is believing and trusting that Jesus is up to the challenges you face. And what does faith do? If that's what faith is, what does faith do? It runs to wherever Jesus is. They're freaking out on the boat, and what do? They run to Jesus. They had little faith, but it was in the right place. It was in the right person. And so they run to Jesus and say, Lord, save dying. And Jesus comes through. In that case, it took staying on the boat in the storm with Jesus to show faith. But that's not always what it takes. See, there's another story a few chapters later. Jesus has fed the 5,000 and he wants to go on another boat ride. It says this in chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him on the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Jesus always found time to spend time in prayer with his heavenly Father. I read that small verse and I'm so convicted that in the midst of his busyness, of all he did to change the world, he found time by himself to pray to God. Goes on. It says, later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. That word buffeted kind of more means hammered. That boat was getting smashed by the waves. This is immediately getting into one of these, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I'm in a boat again. I'm in a storm. Things are getting crazy again. It's kind of deja vu. And it says this. It says, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Again, completely understandable. Who walks on water? Nobody, really. And so they're freaked out by what they see. Completely understandable that they have some fear. They're in a storm. They see some dude walking on the water. They think it's a ghost. And what does Jesus say? It says, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Jesus is always disclosing who he is. He says, take courage. Take it from me. I'm the one who has it. Then he says, it is I. Horrible translation. You know how it should read? I am. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like what God said to Moses near the burning bush? I am. His powerful presence is there. Jesus is saying, I am the Lord and Master of heaven and earth. No storm is bigger than me. I can conquer even nature that seems like it could swallow you up. Even the sea was an image of chaos and death in that time, and Jesus is walking on it. The very thing that people were worried could swallow you whole, Jesus is walking on top of, and he says, take courage from me. I am. Don't be afraid. And he says that even when it's completely natural that they would be afraid. And Peter says this. He says, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Peter is showing the right attitude of faith. What did we say? What is faith? It's believing and trusting that Jesus is up to the challenges you face. What does faith do? It runs to Jesus wherever he is. Before he was on the boat, easy. Well, now he's on the water. A little more complicated, right? But Peter says in faith, call me out to where you are. I want to go where you are no matter what. No matter how unlikely it seems that I could be with you, call me to you. And what does Jesus say? He says, come. No matter how unlikely it seems that someone could be with Jesus, in whatever situation they find, Jesus can beckon you to come, and you will. No matter how unlikely the pairing seems. I could never be with Jesus in this moment. Where is Jesus? And Jesus says, come. He's out on the water. Again, who walks in the water? Nobody. But Peter says, I got a bright idea. I, in faith, just want to be where Jesus is. So tell me to come out on the water. And Jesus says, come. It's the same power and force that he will calm the wind and the waves with. It's the same power that he rose Lazarus from the grave with. Jesus says, come. It's no longer an option. Peter goes, and what happens? It says, then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water. We often keep going on and go to the part where he sinks. But let's just pause for a second. He wants to be with Jesus. Jesus is in an unlikely place, and he walks on the water. And it says this, and he came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Another one of those brilliant, short prayers. God, save me now. And Jesus says this. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? You got to love Jesus. He saves before he scolds. He sees that he's in need and help, and he reaches out and scoops him up and brings him near and looks him in the eyes and says, oh, you of little faith. But Peter, again, didn't have no faith. He just had little faith, and God can do a lot with a little. And he cries out to be saved, and Jesus saves him. This is the adventure of faith. Asking for huge, impossible things with the high risk of failure, but trusting that God will do something amazing. Do you ask for big things? Don't let anybody tell you that following Jesus is a drag or boring. It is the adventure of a lifetime. If you are bored in your faith, you're doing it wrong. Call me. You can tell me if you like that smile, and I'll tell you how to live an adventure of faith. It is the adventure of a lifetime. Asking for big things, risking big things with the real chance of failure, but depending on God all along the way. That is what faith looks like. Lord, call me wherever you want me. You're up to the challenge, and I'll go. If it's walking on water, great. If it's staying in the boat, great. But I want to be where you are. I believe and I trust that you're up to whatever challenge I face in my life. What's your challenge? What do you need to ask big for? Maybe you're saying, unless God shows up, my marriage is done. I've been in pastoral ministry long enough to see that happen. Maybe you need to ask God for that. Maybe you say, hey, one of my kids just has left the reservation. They're not in the faith anymore. God, bring them back. What is that impossible thing? Maybe it's that sin you can't seem to shake. Maybe you can't even figure out how to spend time with God regularly. And you just need to ask big. God, I want to spend time with you every day. I don't care if it's 5 minutes or 50 minutes. I just want to be with you every day. What's that impossible thing? That big ask with the high risk of failing that you need Jesus to show up in? Do you have the courage to ask, do you in faith believe that he's up to the challenge? And are you willing to go wherever he is? Whether he's in the boat or out of the boat on the water. Will you go be with him? What faith isn't. Faith does not need to know how it will all work out. It doesn't need to know how God will meet the challenges you face. All you need is to believe that he's equal to, greater than, every challenge you face in this life. And the greatest challenge we all face is that Jesus commands something big. He says, be holy as I am holy. And I need about 3 nanoseconds to look at my own life and realize that I don't measure up. That is a challenge I'm not up to. I believe wholeheartedly that the wages of sin are death, and that without the saving grace of Jesus, I will be separated him for all eternity. I'm not up to the challenge of paying for my own sin. But guess who is? Jesus. And he says, I've done it for you. If you are willing to call out to me, Lord, save, dying, I will rush in and I will scoop you up and I will bring you by my side and I will pay for your sin and you will be with me forever. And I will make your life the thrill of a lifetime. And yeah, sometimes you'll get to stay in the boat while it's rocking. And sometimes you have to walk out on water because that's where I am. But I will give you a life of faith. I will tailor-make an experience to bring out the best in you. And it's going to be hard, and you're going to get stressed out, and it's going to take enormous amounts of stuff you don't have, but only I can give. That is the adventure of the Christian faith. So when Jesus asks, where is your faith? I hope we all answer, in you.